I am an expert in Greek mythology and in the poetry of Homer in particular, so it might shock you to learn that I really rather like the 2004 movie Troy, and I don't like Madeline Miller's The Song of Achilles very much. Please allow me to explain myself. If you're new here, hi, I'm Juliet. I'm a writer and historian, and on this channel I cover history and literature relating to the weird and the spooky, and to myth, legend and folklore in general. So let's get into it. I am a history lecturer. My PhD is actually in classics, which is the study of Greek and Latin literature, and my undergraduate dissertation way back when I did my ancient history first degree was actually on the two Homeric poems and Beowulf. I looked at the Iliad, the Odyssey and Beowulf, and at the ways in which history was remembered to a greater or lesser degree in those poems. I also have a master's degree in myth from the University of Bristol, which makes me technically a Master of Myth, which I think is a cool title. So it's probably a bit surprising that I like the movie Troy more than I like the Song of Achilles. I think most classicists are probably the other way around, but I do have my reasons. Also, I will of course mention that this is a personal preference. I'm not claiming that the movie is a better work of art than the Song of Achilles or indeed the Iliad. I, if pushed, would probably say the Song of Achilles is the best work of art of the three, I think, just as a work of art in itself. This is literally about personal preference. My preferred way of engaging with and enjoying this story for me happens to be the movie Troy rather than the Song of Achilles, or, I have to confess, the Iliad itself, though I have of course read it. In this video I am going to have a relatively brief look at the Iliad, at Troy and at Song of Achilles. I'll give a quick shout out to the TV series Troy Fall of a City as well, though I'm not going to look at that in much detail. But before I start, I just want to say a few things about Greek myth in general. Ancient Greek religion was not a religion of the book. When I say a religion of the book, I'm talking about religions like Judaism, Christianity, Islam, where there is a core text that is at the heart of the religion. Christianity is the religion outside of Greek and Roman paganism with which I myself am most familiar, so that is the one I use as a basis for comparison most of all, because I know what I'm talking about if I'm talking about Christianity. So that's not intended to prioritise Christianity, I'm just talking about what I know. Christianity has a text at the heart of Christianity. Different denominations may have slightly different relationships with that text. So I was raised Catholic, where interpretation of the text is key, albeit often interpretation by specific people. There are other denominations that put more emphasis on the translated word itself, and I say translated because usually these denominations are reading the Bible in a language that is not one of its original languages. The original languages of the Bible being Hebrew and New Testament Greek, depending which bit you're reading. And this book, along with other important texts, provides a version of the stories relating to the religion that is canonical, that is not to be disputed. I usually use the term myth to refer to these stories. That is not meant as an indication of whether or not they are true. I am myself a practicing Christian, so if I refer to the mythology of Jesus, I'm not saying I don't believe it, because actually, as it happens, I do. It's more that I'm talking about myth as a concept, as stories that relate to religion, theology and religious practice. Defining what is myth would be a whole other video. There is a book, Mythography by William Doty. As you can see, it's a big book. And about the first 4 chapters of it are just defining what myth is. So it's a complex term with many meanings. The point I'm getting to is that ancient Greek paganism was not a religion of the book. There was not a canonical version of stories relating to the Greek gods or other supernatural and divine entities. There were lots and lots of different stories, and they all coexisted. And the Greeks would write, well, there's this version and this version, this version, and this author says this and this author says this. Particularly when it came to human characters, even more so than gods, but gods as well, authors would write their own stories and they would make changes, and that was just part of what they did. For example, in the story of Medea, the witch princess who marries Jason of Argonaut's fame, in that story, Medea's children die. In earlier versions, they were often killed by Corinthians, or in some cases killed by Medea accidentally while she was trying to make them immortal. Please ignore the dog, I can't get him to stop moving. In Euripides' play Medea, Euripides had Medea murder them in order to get back at Jason for dumping her for a younger woman. And that version stuck, and that is now the version of the story that's best known today, that Medea murders her children to get back at Jason. But as far as we can tell, Euripides seems to have invented that. There isn't any evidence for that version that's any earlier than Euripides' play. So these stories were malleable. Authors were expected to write their own versions and to do interesting things, especially the authors of plays or epic poems. They were expected to do their own thing with the material. Having said that, the closest thing that Greek mythology has to canon is the works of Homer. So these are two poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. There's also a collection of texts called the Homeric hymns that are sometimes associated with the same authorship, but probably not. The Iliad and the Odyssey are both attributed to a poet called Homer, who in the classical period of ancient Greece was thought of as a man who they thought was probably blind. This is mostly on the basis that one of the poets in the story is also blind. Nowadays, we're not sure the same person wrote both poems, and in fact it might have been multiple people on each poem. Basically, they are derived from oral tradition. This was something that was worked out in the 1930s by Milman Parry and Albert Lord. They were studying oral poetry in what was then Yugoslavia, in the Balkans, in Europe, and they realised that the poets that they were studying, they weren't memorising and reproducing the poems, which is what scholars had thought. What they were actually doing is they had the framework of the story and then they were composing the poem as they sang. So they knew the basic outline of the story, but the poem itself was being composed in the performance. One of the kind of tells for this is what's known in Homeric poetry as a Homeric epithet. This is things like, descriptions like swift-footed Achilles. I think Hector is of the flashing helm. One of the famous ones is the wine-dark sea, because people have wept blood trying to work out why Homer says the sea is the colour of wine. Red wine, usually, in Greece. These are all descriptions that can be added if you are talking about the sea, Achilles, Hector, or left out. And one of the functions they perform is if a bard, a poet, is composing as they sing, as they perform the poem, they can add wine dark sea to the description in order to fill out the metre, because each line of the poem needs to have the right number of syllables with the right stresses in order for the poetry to work. Homeric poetry is in dactylic hexameter, which is the metre of Homeric poetry. So the poet can say wine dark sea if they need more syllables, or just sea if they don't. And these epithets are all over Homeric poetry, and this is how Parry and Lord worked out that the Homeric poems must have been oral traditions that then at some point between 800 and 600 BCE somebody wrote down, or multiple somebodies wrote down. They're far too long to perform in one evening. The Homeric poems are very, very long. The two poems are both 24 books, a book being a chapter, essentially. And if I grab a copy of one of them. This is the Iliad, translated by Robert Fagles. This is the version I used for my undergraduate dissertation. It was the translation that was recommended by my supervisor. I wrote my undergraduate dissertation in 2003-04, so there are more recent translations available than the Fagles one, but it's still very good. And you can see the size of it. Yeah. And it's relatively small type. So they're very, very long. And they wouldn't have been performed in one evening, so these are presumably collections of stories. And you can kind of see that in the composition. They're quite episodic. The 24 books all cover quite different things, and a lot of them can kind of stand out by themselves. In both the Iliad and the Odyssey, a lot of sections you can take out and it makes a story in itself. So it looks like all of these traditions have been put together. I am going to refer to Homer as the author of both poems, just because, honestly, it's easier. Otherwise, every time I'm tripping over my words saying, well, whichever person or people wrote down the Iliad and the Odyssey. So I'm just going to use Homer as a label for the people who wrote down the Iliad and the Odyssey, and they would have been writing down the words of bards and oral poets performing them. It might have been who knows many of them. It's just, yeah, I'm just going to call them Homer. But that's the kind of composition of these poems. Each poem tells a story that is part of the Trojan War mythic cycle. A mythic cycle is a whole collection of stories relating to a particular event, like the Trojan War or a particular thing. Jason and the Argonauts would be a different mythic cycle. The Trojan War cycle is huge. It goes all the way from the story of the judgment of Paris that kicks off the war, where Paris is asked to judge which goddess is most beautiful out of Athena, Hera, and Aphrodite, and he chooses Aphrodite, and she's promised him the most beautiful woman in the world, so he gets Helen, who's married to Menelaus, blah, blah, blah. Origin of the Trojan War. Starts with that, goes all the way through stories about heroes not wanting to go fight the war and how everybody had wanted to marry Helen, and Menelaus won Helen, and now they all have to defend his right to be married to Helen, and there's 10 years of war, and obviously there's the bit at the end where Odysseus comes up with the idea of pretending they've all gone away and there's a giant wooden horse and they're all inside it and they get in the walls. It's very long. And then, of course, Odysseus' story carries on. There's also the Nostoi, the homecomings of all the heroes from Troy. Odysseus is the best known and longest, but the story of Agamemnon coming home and getting murdered, the story of Menelaus coming home and living happily ever after with Helen because they're fine while everyone else around them's collapsed and fallen into God knows what. It's a huge cycle, and the Iliad and the Odyssey both tell a selection of stories from in that cycle. The Odyssey is the Nostos of Odysseus, that is the homecoming journey of Odysseus. That's the story that it tells in all these various episodes. The Iliad is a story that takes place towards the end of the war, but it doesn't include the beginning of the war. It refers to the reasons for the war, but it doesn't kind of cover that part of the story. It doesn't include the end of the war. The Trojan horse is not in the Iliad. The Trojan horse is described in the Aeneid, which is a Roman poem written centuries later that has a flashback to the Trojan horse and the experience of the fall of Troy from the point of view of a Trojan, Aeneas. Addendum, the Trojan horse is also mentioned in the Odyssey. I forgot to say that. I was so busy blethering away. There is a point in the Odyssey where Odysseus is a guest of the Princess Nausicaa and her father, and there is a bard, Demodocus. This is the blind bard that everybody thinks Homer based on himself if Homer was a person, etc., etc. And this bard tells the story of the Trojan War, including the story of the horse, and talks about Odysseus's role coming up with the idea of the horse. So the Trojan horse does appear in flashback in the Odyssey, but it does not appear in the Iliad. But the Iliad does not include the Trojan horse or the end of the war or even the death of Achilles. It is a poem about a set of incidents, and its theme is the anger of Achilles. The opening line is, "Sing to me, O muse, the wrath of Achilles." How does Fagles translate it? Fagles' translation is, "Rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles." It's a story about Achilles having a hissy fit. The anger of Achilles. But it has all these other episodes put in. And it's also a story about the deaths of Patroclus and Hector. My PhD supervisor actually had a theory that Homer kind of invented Patroclus and Hector because the whole thing is so self-contained, or Hector in particular, I think. It's so long ago now, I can't remember the details of his theory. But it was to do with the fact that the Iliad kind of represents themes from across the Trojan War cycle, but doesn't actually hit any of the main points of the story. But then, of course, Hector and Patroclus become significant characters in the story of the Trojan War because Homer is the earliest Western literature. There's also the Epic of Gilgamesh is older, from the ancient Near East. Egyptian literature is obviously older. There is older literature, much older literature in the world, but in terms of Greek and Latin literature, the Homeric poems are the oldest written literature we have in Greek or Latin. There are earlier records in Linear B, which is related to Greek, but they're mostly records about sheep and oxen and things. Anyway, I'm becoming distracted. I teach like 2.5-hour classes on Homer every year in my myth and religion module, so I'm trying to keep this video to a sensible time, so I'm going to move on. So a plot summary of the Iliad is really more a list of episodes and events that happen in each book. There is a basic overarching plot, which is that Achilles has a slave girl called Briseis. Agamemnon has a slave girl called Chryseis. Agamemnon's slave girl has to be taken away to make the gods happy. She has to be given back. So he takes Achilles' slave girl, Briseis. And Achilles is very cross because Briseis is his prize. Achilles in the Iliad is not concerned about the well-being of Briseis or Briseis as a person. She is a prize that he has won for his fighting prowess, and it is detrimental to his honour and his glory as a warrior that Agamemnon has taken her. So Achilles gets very, very angry and refuses to fight. Achilles' close companion Patroclus, their relationship varies across different versions, but basically extremely close companion of some description. Patroclus goes and fights instead. He puts on Achilles' armour because the Greeks are losing, they're doing very badly, so Patroclus puts on Achilles' armour and goes and fights in Achilles' stead, and he is killed by the Trojan prince Hector. Achilles is then even more angry. He cries on the beach to his mum. His mum tells him that he can live fast and die young, or live a long life but be forgotten, whereas if he dies in the war he'll be remembered forever and have everlasting kleos, glory. Achilles then gets a shield, a fancy present from the gods, goes and fights again, and he fights and kills Hector. Achilles then refuses to bury either man because he's snuggling Patroclus's corpse in his tent at night, and Hector he's just refusing to bury in general. If you are not properly buried in ancient Greek religion, you cannot cross over to the afterlife. So Patroclus has to show up in a dream and ask Achilles to bury him properly, and then the Trojan king Priam has to sneak into the Greek camp to beg Achilles to return the body of his son Hector so they can bury him properly. And then Achilles returning the body of Hector to Priam is the end of the story. The kind of subsiding of the wrath of Achilles brings that story to an end. So that gives you the basic plot outline. That's the kind of core story. I will briefly kind of read out a chapter by chapter or book by book plot summary from Duke University in the States. This will give you an idea of the episodic nature of the story. So book 1, there's plague. This is what results in Agamemnon's slave being taken away because she's the daughter of a priest, etc. Achilles gets mad. Anger of Achilles. Book 2 opens with a dream that Zeus sends to Agamemnon to trick him into attacking Troy, even though the Greeks can do badly. It's a whole thing with the gods. Then much of book 2 is taken up with the catalogue of ships. This is as dull as it sounds. Obviously, when I was reading this, I dutifully read through the whole thing because it was the subject of my undergraduate dissertation. And oh my goodness, I thought I'd made a big mistake when I got to the catalogue of ships. It is literally a list of all the ships from Greece that sailed to Troy for the Trojan War. It is very interesting historically because some of the places that are sending ships to the Trojan War are places that were important, economically successful palace sites in the Mycenaean period when the Trojan War takes place, but were much smaller and less important in the classical period and the archaic period when the poems are written. So the Trojan War takes place in the Mycenaean period in the Bronze Age. Then there's a big gap where we have no written texts for a while. Then the archaic period in Greek history is about 800 to kind of 490 BCE, and that's when the poems are written down. So the catalogue of ships is historically fascinating because it shows that some elements of Mycenaean history have been remembered in the oral tradition, but to read as a work of art, oh my God, skip it, skip it. If you want to read the Iliad, please do yourself a favour and skip the catalogue of ships. Book 3 features a duel between Paris and Menelaus, which Menelaus wins, but Paris scarpers off back to Troy before he can be killed, runs back off to Helen, and the war just starts up again. And then we've got things like Book 4, Agamemnon reviews his troops. Book 5, it's what's called an Aristeia of a man called Diomedes. An Aristeia is a description of a warrior doing really well in battle, killing loads of other people, killing loads of the enemy, and showing off his soldierly prowess. It comes from the word aristos, best. So it's a warrior demonstrating that he's the best, that he's amazing at killing people. So the Aristeia of Diomedes is an entire book of Diomedes killing people. And I have to say, personally, I found that really boring too. Book 6, we have a very touching scene between Hector, Prince of Troy, and his wife Andromache, as well as some scenes with a Greek called Glaukos. Book 7, Hector fights one of the Ajaxes. There's 2 people called Ajax in the Trojan War myth. He fights one of them. There's also a pause to bury the dead. Book 8, Trojans advance. Book 9, Agamemnon sends an embassy to Achilles, including Odysseus and Nestor, one of the older Greek soldiers, to try and persuade Achilles to come back to the fighting because they need him. But Achilles refuses. This is what prompts Patroclus to go instead. Book 10, a Trojan called Dolon is caught spying on the Greek camp by Odysseus and Diomedes. Book 11 is the Aristeia of Agamemnon himself. Book 12, fighting at the walls of Troy. Book 13, fighting near the ships. Book 14, Greeks advance a bit. Book 15, retreat to the ships. I like war stories. I do enjoy literature about war, I'm not gonna lie. If I had to choose between the Iliad and the Odyssey to read again for pleasure, it would be the Odyssey. Book 16 is the Aristeia of Patroclus, which is a bit more kind of plot-centric as far as the plot of the Iliad overall goes, because this is Patroclus's glorious deeds in battle, and Patroclus is key to the kind of core plot of the story, the poem. And of course, his Aristeia concludes with him being killed, unfortunately, by Hector, Prince of Troy. Book 17, Aristeia of Menelaus, and some fighting over Patroclus' body, which is recovered and brought back to the Greeks. Book 18, the gods give Achilles a shield. Book 19, Achilles' cross. The university put this as Achilles' anger is unleashed, I should say. They were more formal about it. Book 20, gods get in the battle and fight each other. Book 21, Achilles fights a river. It's technically a river god, but basically he fights the river. He also has a talking horse. People think of the Iliad as the war poem and the serious poem, and the Odyssey is the poem with sirens and princesses and giants, one-eyed giants and things. And the Odyssey actually has a lot more just people killing each other than you realise. The fairy tale-like bits are only 3 books out of 24. And the Iliad has a talking horse in it. Finally, book 22, Achilles kills Hector, and that I did enjoy. So I'm not completely immune to war stories, but I want to be kind of invested in the characters. I want there to be some kind of plot to it beyond just people killing each other. Now this bit is very memorable. There's a scene of Achilles chasing Hector around the walls of Troy, and it's like a dream where Hector's running and Achilles is running, and Hector never gets further away, but Achilles never gets closer, and it's very powerfully written. And because these are, you know, the main characters of the story and we care about what happens to them, it's much more meaningful than the earlier ones. Book 23 is funeral games for Patroclus after his ghost shows up in a dream to tell Achilles to please bury him. And book 24 is Priam coming to ransom the body of Hector and the end of the poem. As you've probably gathered from that summary, there are scenes in the Iliad that really stand out and are really memorable. We're more than 20 years later, and I can still remember reading about Hector putting on his helmet and scaring his baby son Astyanax because he looks frightening with the helmet on. I can still remember that description of running as if in a dream where neither ever gets closer to the other and neither can ever escape, and oh my goodness, that like brought back real nightmares. Very well described. The climax where Priam has to come and beg the man who killed his son to get his son's body back is very powerful, very well written. The relationship between Achilles and his mother is very interesting, and the scenes between them and that whole thing of, do I go and die and get eternal glory, or do I go home and live happily ever after, but I'm forgotten after I die? It's fascinating. So there is some really powerful stuff in the Iliad, and I would absolutely recommend reading some of it. It is sandwiched between a lot of stuff that honestly I found a bit dull. Just people I'm not particularly invested in killing each other doesn't really appeal to me, and I never want to read the catalogue of ships again. Other people have enjoyed the whole poem, so don't let me put you off. If you're not sure, maybe start with the Odyssey and see how you feel. I realise chronologically they go the other way around. The Iliad obviously takes place during the war, and the Odyssey is coming home from the war, but you know the story of the Trojan War, it doesn't really matter. And I'm sure a lot of this is because of the nature of the poem. It's loads of different oral traditions, or loads of different stories relating to the overall oral tradition of the Trojan War being put together with an overarching narrative to pull them together. Another reason that the Odyssey works better when compared with modern novels is because it has a much clearer through plot. It's about Odysseus trying to get home, and it also has scenes about his wife and son waiting for him to come home and what's going on with them, but that clearly relates to the main story of Odysseus getting home. So the Odyssey is structured much more like a modern novel, whereas the Iliad is this incident or series of incidents from toward the end of the war, without the beginning of the war, without the end of the war, and loads of time devoted to characters that if you are an ancient Greek and you've been hearing about these heroes your whole life, you're probably already invested in, but as a modern reader coming to it, not really knowing the material, you're just not invested in Diomedes particularly. Because of the nature of the poem, modern adaptations generally end up adding more context to a greater or lesser degree. So at the very least, they will usually add more context about the end of the war. The story takes place toward the end of the war. It is specifically mentioned that it's near the end of the war that all this is happening. Many of them will expand out and include other aspects of Trojan War mythology. Most adaptations do not just do that bit. With some exceptions. In fact, my own is an exception. In my book, Creepy Classics, Ghost Stories from Ancient Greece, I retell a couple of Trojan War stories, but particularly the story of Achilles and Patroclus from the Iliad. The dream where Patroclus' ghost comes to Achilles is retold in my book. This is a short story. So there I've gone the other way. I've left out the rest of the Iliad, never mind the rest of the Trojan War cycle. And I've picked up on that specific incident and retold it as a short story. I've also retold Odysseus in the underworld as a short story. So obviously, blanket statements don't apply to everything. And in my case, I took out context rather than adding it. But a feature length or novel length or TV series length adaptation will usually add material to expand the story beyond a sequence of events near the end of the war. I think there's also an additional element of a story about Troy without the horse in it probably isn't going to go down very well with modern audiences. For a lot of people, the only thing they'll know about the Trojan War when coming to the story is the horse bit, because that is the very famous bit in modern culture. In ancient Greece, people would have been familiar with the whole cycle of stories already. But in the modern world, they probably know the horse and not much else, maybe a bit about Helen. So not having the horse would be a bit of a disappointment. I have to confess, I was a bit disappointed when I read the Iliad for my dissertation as an undergrad. I can't remember if I don't think I realised the horse wasn't in it. I was a bit like, where's the horse? Yeah, it was upsetting. So modern versions will usually include the horse. So on to my favourite version of the story, which, as I say, is people are going to think is very strange, which is Wolfgang Petersen's 2004 film Troy. Even weirder, I also don't particularly like the lead actor. I don't know him as a person. I find Brad Pitt is not always terribly convincing. He's great in some contemporary roles. He was great in Thelma and Louise. I suspect he's good in things like Fight Club, though I haven't seen it. But I find if he's playing a historical character or if he's doing a different genre like comedy, I'm less convinced. When he appeared in Friends, when he used to be married to Jennifer Aniston and he did a guest role in Friends, it was painful. He did not understand comic timing and he did not understand how to act comedy in a way that was natural while still preserving the joke. It was overdone. And in Troy, I just didn't find him very convincing as a Trojan. Sorry, Brad Pitt. I'm sure he doesn't care. However, the rest of the cast is great, especially Eric Bana as Hector. You've got Peter O'Toole as Priam, Sean Bean as Odysseus. This is the one film where everybody else dies and Sean Bean lives. So it's worth watching for that alone. It's got Orlando Bloom as Paris, Diane Kruger as Helen. It's a great cast, Pitt aside. It has a score by James Horner, and apart from the fact that occasionally you might feel like you can hear the Titanic sinking or the Enterprise being attacked, because James Horner also wrote the scores for Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan and for Titanic. It's a great score, it's beautifully shot, I like it. It does, of course, make numerous changes to plot and character. And as I mentioned, this is something Greek writers did. A Greek playwright would not just write the same story exactly as is in Homer and turn it into a play. That would not be interesting. So for the most part, I have no problem with changes to plot and character, with some reservations. But things like Achilles loving Briseis as a person, a modern audience is not going to be remotely interested in a main character who treats a woman like a trophy and doesn't care about her as a person. So, of course, Achilles has to care about Briseis as a person. Things like that I don't have a problem with. It takes a rationalising approach to the story of trying to take out all of the divine supernatural elements. It's an interesting approach. Mainly it means there's no gods. People will talk about the gods, but the gods don't appear as characters, with the exception of Achilles' mother, Thetis, who's in this weird kind of in-between area. Basically, she's played by Julie Christie, and she just stands around ankle-deep in water all the time as a sort of nod to the fact she's a sea goddess. but it's not specific about her being a goddess. I'm not really sure how well the rationalising entirely works, but obviously they take out there's no fighting a river, there's no talking horse, and no gods except for Thetis involved, focusing on the human conflict and the human story, which is not in itself a bad thing. And the plot is not a million miles from the Iliad. It does focus predominantly on the wrath of Achilles. Hi, just refilming my summary of Troy the next day to correct myself. Anyway, so what Troy does is it sort of shows the whole story of the war, but because it takes a rationalizing approach that removes the gods, that story is a little bit different, and also it does it very quickly. It takes out the 10 years part. Kind of the point of the Trojan War, one of the points of the Trojan War is it lasts for 10 years. It's a 10-year siege, and then Odysseus takes another 10 years to get home, and his baby son has grown up by the time he gets home. This movie condenses the timeline so that they can do the entire war within the movie and without aging anybody up. Terry Pratchett actually had a really good joke about this in his book, Eric, which is a kind of spoof of Christopher Marlowe's play Faustus, and it involves visiting the Discworld's version of Helen of Troy, who is called Eleanor of Tsort. And Pratchett talked about how when they go and visit Eleanor of Tsort, it's been 10 or 20 years since she ran off, and she is a lot older and doesn't quite look like she did when she was younger. The most beautiful woman in the world doesn't look quite the same by the time they actually visit her many, many years later. I don't know if that would be written now. That book was written in the 80s, but I don't know. It was funny at the time. Anyway, so the movie condenses the timeline so everything takes place within a much shorter space of time. And since there are no gods, it's all human motivations. There's no judgment of Paris. There's no, Paris being asked to judge between goddesses and being promised the most beautiful woman in the world or any of that. Rather, it is a political, diplomatic visit. Hector and Paris, the princes of Troy, are visiting Menelaus, king of Sparta, and his wife Helen. Menelaus is played by Brendan Gleeson, and Helen by Diane Kruger. Agamemnon, Menelaus' brother, who is the king of Mycenae, is also there. He's played by Brian Cox. And while they are visiting, Paris and Helen fall in love, and Paris smuggles Helen onto their ships as they leave. So this is going with the version where Helen goes with Paris willingly, where they are in love with each other and she has gone with him. Greek versions varied. Sometimes she was seduced, which is a bit of an ancient Greek notion, the idea that women just can't help but fall into men's arms if they give them any attention whatsoever. Sometimes she's abducted. Sometimes she goes willingly, they fall in love. It varies depending on the author. In some versions, Helen doesn't go to Troy at all, and Paris is given a shadow of Helen to take to Troy, and Helen goes and lives in Egypt the entire time, which is partly to explain how she and Menelaus end up living happily ever after afterwards, because that doesn't seem like it would be a happy marriage. But in some versions, it turns out she was in Egypt the whole time anyway, so her and Menelaus are fine. Anyway. So in the movie, that covers the origin of the war, and then the war starts straight away, and then they skip the 10-year siege. It's a much shorter siege. The movie then covers the material of the Iliad, and then it adds the end of the war onto the end, and it kind of finishes off the stories of the main characters. Menelaus a bit different. We'll come back to that. It doesn't do the Nos story, it doesn't do the homecomings. So Agamemnon and Odysseus' stories aren't finished. But it shows the death of Achilles, it shows the death of Paris, it shows Aeneas escaping to go and found not Rome, but the village that will eventually produce Romulus and Remus, who will found Rome. And I went to see it with a whole bunch of fellow ancient history students. We were all doing our ancient history degrees at the time. And there's a point in the movie where Paris says, "Aeneas, take this sword," and sends him off to run away and save the last of the Trojans. And we all went, "Yay!" And everyone else in the cinema is like, we have no idea what this is about. Anyway, so the movie covers in a sense the whole Trojan War story, except for the homecomings, but from a human point of view and with a compressed timeline. There is one change the movie makes that for me does go a bit too far. Although there wasn't a canon in Greek mythology, there was a set to the stories. They have a shape. And if you change that shape too much, then it becomes not recognisably the same story. And the characters' biographies have an outline. People live and die where they live and die, generally speaking. Like the example of Euripides and Medea. Medea's children die in most, if not all, versions. It's who kills them, how they die, why that comes about that Euripides changes, rather than the deaths themselves. So there is a change in the movie Troy that, for me, does go too far, and that is in the duel between Paris and Menelaus. Menelaus wins, Paris runs back to Hector, runs away, and then instead of that being the end of it and they just start fighting again, Hector kills Menelaus. And all our little group of ancient historians watching this movie went, "What? Did he kill me? He just killed Menelaus. Did he kill Menelaus? How can you kill Menelaus?" That is too much. It's one thing to make Achilles and Briseis closer, and I think they have a romantic relationship in this movie. So it's one thing to have a romance between Achilles and Briseis that isn't in the Iliad. That doesn't massively change things, and in fact it helps the story for a modern audience. It is quite another thing to kill Menelaus, one of the few people from the Trojan War who gets home and lives happily ever after. He gets Helen back, because they win. They go home. And they're perfectly fine while everybody else is murdered or delayed for 10 years or whatever. This is a kind of change that we wouldn't see a Greek author make. They would respect the overall shape of the story more than that. The other aspect that doesn't entirely work is that Achilles and Patroclus are made into cousins. Another quick addendum, technically I should say Achilles and Patroclus actually are cousins. They are first cousins. That is not something that is particularly emphasised in the mythology though, or really talked about. So in fairness to Troy, it's not inaccurate, but Troy emphasises the relationship as cousins and the idea of Achilles as wanting to protect his younger cousin and Patroclus looking up to his cousin. And it emphasises all of that, whereas the Iliad doesn't mention that they have a blood relationship. It is more about their emotional relationship and the fact that they are comrades and brothers in arms. And that's really more important than the fact that technically they are in fact related. The point of the story is their relationship. I mean, for one thing, in Greek mythology, Patroclus is older than Achilles. Achilles is the bright young thing, the youth, the glorious, beautiful, as yet unmarried youth. Patroclus is an older man who has been exiled from his home for murdering somebody, if I remember right. Homer is never explicit about the nature of their relationship, but in the classical period, it was assumed that they were lovers, that their relationship was both romantic and sexual. This is partly because in classical Greece, it was extremely common and it was socially encouraged for an older man to have a younger male lover. Some relationships would be romantic, some would be sexual, some would be both, some might be platonic, and that is where we get the word platonic, because of Plato's preference for a not sexual relationship in these cases. But that was a very, very, very common relationship that we see all the time. And of course, there were also people who were in relationships with other men, who were in relationships with other men of their own age and who lived together, and obviously that as well. But that particular setup was very, very common in classical Greece. So they assumed that Achilles and Patroclus were lovers, and their only confusion was the role in that Achilles appears to be playing the role of the older lover even though he's younger, and Patroclus appears to be playing the role of the younger lover even though he's older, and this is something that is expressly talked about in Plato's Symposium. I'm not going to say more on that. That was my PG-13 explanation of that. If you ever come to any of my classes, you get the R-rated explanation. But I'm not doing that on a YouTube video. So, Achilles and Patroclus are assumed to be lovers by later Greeks, and that is certainly supported by the text. Homer is not specific. He never says, by the way, they were having intimate relations in their tent. Achilles does cuddle Patroclus' dead body, which is indicative. He tries to embrace his ghost as well. So the text fully supports that reading without being completely explicit. Even if you wanted to assume that their relationship was not physical, the story is clearly based on an extremely close emotional relationship between these two characters. And at no point does Homer feel it necessary to say they are related. So I can see why the movie Troy's done it. They don't want to do it as a romantic relationship. They've decided it's 2004 and they have decided that that is not the route they want to go. In the same year, Oliver Stone's Alexander came out and did depict historically accurately Alexander's relationships with both men and women, which you really can't make a movie about Alexander without doing that. That is what his life story was, and it was quite controversial. So the makers of the movie clearly did not want to put a gay relationship at the heart of their blockbuster movie, which is sad, but that is the case. I would respect them more, I think, if they hadn't tried to force the cousins thing and they made Patroclus younger, so it's this whole protective, I have to look after my cousin vibe, almost like brothers but not brothers. Would have been better if they'd just made them brothers, to be honest. Then you could have that kind of, that's kind of what they're going for, is this I have to look after my younger brother / cousin vibe. I don't know, it's a shame. I think depictions of Achilles and Patroclus as lovers are more convincing and make a more powerful story. And if you're not going to do that, then make it a story about the power of male friendship and make that what it's about, rather than, I think it's the fact they felt they needed some kind of familial relationship that I find disappointing. I don't see why they have to be cousins to love each other, regardless of whether that love is sexual or romantic or not. It's a story about male love, whatever form that love takes. You don't need to change it to make them cousins for it to be a powerful story. That almost, well, it doesn't take away from it. I love my cousins, but I don't know, it just seems unnecessary to me. Before I move on to the Song of Achilles, I do want to give a brief shout out to the BBC Netflix series from 2018, Troy, Fall of a City. I'm not going to cover this at length. It's quite long, and honestly, it's kind of boring. I reviewed it as it came out for Den of Geek, so I'll link to those reviews below. It wasn't terrible, but I just found it a bit dull. There's a certain type of show, particularly made in the late 2010s and into the early 2020s, where there was a fashion for these extremely serious, quite grim shows with not very much humour. Now, I have nothing against a bit of grim. I love Game of Thrones, but Game of Thrones is full of humour, as well as the grim stuff. Even the most serious story needs humour. Hamlet has jokes in it. Titanic has jokes in it. It's something that I find, if something is just completely po-faced and taking itself very, very seriously, then it loses me a bit. So I found it a little bit dull. But I did want to give it a quick shout out here rather than giving it the full treatment, just to highlight two things. One is it includes the gods. It goes all the way back and tries to cover almost the entire Trojan War cycle, but not the Nostoi, the Homecomings, particularly not the Odyssey. I think they were hoping for a season 2 that would be the Odyssey. That didn't happen. But they go all the way back to the story of the judgment of Paris and the origin of the Trojan War, which is Paris, the Prince of Troy, being asked to judge which goddess is most beautiful and all of that. And it actually incorporates the gods, and the gods taking part in the fighting like they do in the Iliad, which is kind of cool. I like and respect that it tried to do that. I don't know how successful it was, but I respect the attempt. And the other thing that I really loved about this series was the characterization and performance of Achilles. David Jacey played Achilles, and now this is a compliment to Jacey as an actor. He was so unlikable, and I mean the character. Jacey, I'm sure, is absolutely lovely. Never met him, don't know the man. I'm sure he's very nice. His portrayal of Achilles was very unlikable in the best way, because Achilles, through both writing and performance, came across as, honestly, not a very nice person. And honestly, if you look at the Iliad, Achilles is not a very nice person. Hector is a lovely person. Patroclus is quite a nice person. Briseis seems to be quite a nice person. Achilles, not so much. The whole story is about the anger of Achilles. He is a very violent, volatile person. And David Jacey's performance was just brilliant. It really got across some of these aspects of the character that tend to be neglected, left out, skimmed over, or changed in other interpretations, partly because of making Achilles the hero, and then the adaptations want to make him admirable and likable and make him the protagonist, and they want to make us like him. Now, the fact he was so unlikable, maybe that's partly why I didn't connect with the show so much. There are downsides to doing this, but it is a very interesting interpretation of the source material, and I thought Jacey's performance was just absolutely brilliant. Best thing about that show by far. So finally, on to the Song of Achilles. Now, I am not trying to say that the Song of Achilles is bad. I'm not sure it's for me. I should say, I did finish it. I read it quite a few years ago now, actually. I'm very bad at finishing books if they're not for work. I love reading and I love books, but my work is reading. So anything that's not for work, and in this case, I wasn't doing this for a book or anything, it was just for kind of fun and interest. Anything not for work, if it doesn't really grab me, I am DNFing it within like 10 pages because I just don't have the energy. I will just lie there and watch YouTube video instead. It has to really, sorry, the dog's making noise. It has to really grab my attention. So I did finish the Song of Achilles willingly. I enjoyed reading it. It kept me reading. I wanted to keep reading. I wanted to get to the end. So I am not saying it's a bad book by any means. Interestingly, rather than choosing a bit of the Trojan War story to tell, what the Song of Achilles does is it tells Achilles' life story. So not the story of Achilles' anger, which is told in the Iliad, although obviously it doesn't get to that, but his whole biography from birth to death. And it's told from the point of view of Patroclus. It's also told as a romance, and they are explicitly lovers, both physical and romantic. Some of the things I do really like about this book, it includes lots of aspects of mythology relating to Achilles that often don't get into other adaptations and other versions. Things like Achilles is raised and taught by a centaur called Chiron. That's part of his story. There's an incident where he's trying to avoid going to war at Troy. Again, it's this whole thing where everybody who wanted to marry Helen, once Menelaus gets Helen. Helen really has no say in this. They all have to support Menelaus's right to Helen, so when she runs off with or is kidnapped by, depending on version, Paris, they all have to go and get her back, blah, blah, blah. Loads of them don't want to. Odysseus pretends to be insane, and Achilles dresses up as a young woman, because he's still very young and beardless, on the island of Skyros, and he hides among the young women on the island of Skyros to try and get out of the war. And that's adapted in here, and it's fairly obvious why a lot of those elements don't make it into a lot of versions. For one thing, they're quite early in the story, but also modern ideas of heroism do not involve dressing up as a young woman and hiding among a bunch of teenage girls on an island, nor do they involve pretending mental illness to try and get out of it, Odysseus. So seeing all those stories that don't often get told in modern contexts is really good fun. It does include gods, centaurs battling the river. There's still no talking horse, much to my disappointment. But the fight with the river god, the gods in general, the fact Achilles' mother is a goddess, and of course Chiron the centaur are all in there. Madeline Miller also adopts a classical technique of using the vivid present tense for battle scenes, which is kind of fun. So this means that the book is not all written in the present tense. Some of it is in the past tense, so we did this, we did this. And then for action scenes, it often moves into the present tense. Achilles sees this, I see this happens, etc. It's something that classical epic poems often do to make the battle scenes more exciting and to make them feel more immediate. And they will switch between past tense and present tense, which is something Madeline Miller then does in Song of Achilles, and it's kind of fun seeing that literary technique replicated. So, what is my problem with it? Well, it relates to the romance. I don't have a problem with it being a romance at all. I think Achilles and Patroclus as romantic and sexual lovers makes sense, fully supported by the Iliad. It's how their relationship has been interpreted for thousands of years. So that idea in itself, I have no problem with. What I don't like is what comes across to me as the incredibly sappy way Patroclus talks about Achilles. And I just find it a bit too much. I don't read much romance. I've read some bits of chick lit, like Bridget Jones, I love. I've read a couple of the Outlander books, which I enjoy a lot. But I don't read a lot of romance, so maybe this is just me not fully appreciating the genre. But I read The Song of Achilles some years ago now, and I read it right after I had read Twilight. And it kept reminding me of Twilight. Now, such is my dedication to this YouTube channel that I have actually bought myself a second copy of Twilight, spent money on it twice, to demonstrate what I mean, so that I could go through Twilight electronically and highlight some sections to show what I mean. I'm not saying that Madeline Miller is ripping off Twilight, I should say, nothing like that. It's just the tone, the way that the narrator main character talks about their love interest is just too much for me, honestly. I'll read a couple of samples from Twilight and a couple of samples from the Song of Achilles. And you may disagree with me, let me know in the comments, but here we go. So Bella on Edward in Twilight. I glanced sideways at the beautiful boy who was looking at his tray now, picking a bagel to pieces with long pale fingers. His mouth was moving very quickly, his perfect lips barely opening. Another page. I tried to keep my eyes away from his perfection as much as possible, but I slipped often. Each time his beauty pierced me through with sadness. We have another one. In the darkness he looked much more normal, still pale, still dreamlike in his beauty, but no longer the fantastic sparkling creature of our sunlit afternoon. If you've read Twilight, you know what that one's referring to. Sparkly vampires. And the final one I wanted to pick out. Edward is the youngest, the one with the reddish-brown hair, the beautiful one, the godlike one. That's probably why the Song of Achilles kept reminding me of Twilight. One of the things the Song of Achilles talks about a lot is the fact that Odysseus is the son of a goddess, Thetis. He is god-born. He is part god. And this fact is mentioned quite a lot, which is probably what put Twilight in my head. And then I just found some of the descriptions of Achilles just felt too much. So, Patroclus on Achilles in the Song of Achilles. In the moonlight, I could just make out the shape of his face, sculptor perfect across the room. His lips were parted slightly, an arm thrown carelessly above his head. He looked different in sleep, beautiful but cold as moonlight. Then a conversation about gods. Do you want to be a god? It was easier this time. Not yet, he said. A tightness I had not known was there eased a little. I would not lose him yet. He cupped a hand against his chin. His features looked finer than usual, like carved marble. That, I'm sorry, really reminded me of Twilight. Let's see, I won't read all of them. I picked out loads of these yesterday, making notes on my e-reader and highlighting the bits that I wanted to talk about. But I've highlighted loads, so I won't read them all. Let's see. His face is carved and unmovable, like the statue of a stern god. That really reminded me of Twilight. And then I've highlighted some more serious bits. So, I mean, it's probably just me. It's probably partly a result of the fact that, by pure coincidence, I happened to read both of these books at a similar time in life, quite close together. If I hadn't read them fairly close together to each other, maybe that wouldn't have occurred to me. Maybe I just don't appreciate the romance genre very much. I think that also combined with the fact that I was really interested in the story that appears in the Iliad, and that is right at the end in the last couple chapters. And again, that's not wrong, and in fact in the Iliad itself, the actual core of the story about Patroclus and Achilles and Hector happens in a few books at the end. So it actually replicates the structure of the Iliad. And the book is telling the whole story of Achilles' life, and it's telling all these other bits of his life, which is really interesting. So I'm not saying it's wrong, but for me personally, as fun as it was to read about Chiron and Skyros and all the other stuff, I really kind of wanted to get to the Iliad. It's called the Song of Achilles. I'm expecting, sing to me muse of the wrath of Achilles. It was a lot of romance for a long time. And then the Iliad suddenly, in a couple of chapters, right at the very end. And when I say a couple of chapters at the end, there's like 32 chapters or something. Let me see. There's 33 chapters in this book. And the Iliad is right at the end, like, I forget exactly, but like chapters 30 to 33 or something. So the bit I was interested in, it took absolutely forever to get through and then went through quite quickly. So I hope that explains my issue, hello doggy, with the Song of Achilles. I don't think it's bad. I totally understand why people love it. A lot of the choices Madeline Miller makes in this book I really like. I like the representation of Achilles and Patroclus as lovers. I have represented them as lovers in my own retelling of this story. I like the inclusion of more of the mythology, but I would have liked... Oh, dog's knocking the table over. I would have liked more Iliad. A little, just proportionally, a bit more Iliad and Trojan War and a bit less everything else. And I just couldn't quite get over some of the language and the way Patroclus was talking about Achilles, because I just couldn't get Twilight out of my head. And I just felt like I was reading like Achilles Patroclus fan fiction, of which there is plenty on the internet. And there's nothing wrong with fan fiction either. Fan fiction's great. I think it wasn't quite what I was expecting entirely. I don't know. It just reminded me of Twilight too much, and I just couldn't get past that. Dog's shifting the furniture. But that's just my opinion. So what do you think? Do you think the movie Troy has redeemable qualities? I know it doesn't tend to be popular. I think the killing off of Menelaus has a lot to do with that, and the cousins thing, I think, didn't entirely go down well. What do you think? Do you think it's redeemable? Did you see Troy Fall of a City? Did you enjoy it more than I did? There is some really good stuff in Troy Fall of a City. It did kind of frustrate me. I wanted more from it, but just couldn't quite get on with it. Do you love the Song of Achilles? Do you think I'm being completely unfair comparing it to Twilight? Or maybe we need to have more respect for Twilight as a work of literature and go the other way. Let's not talk people down. Maybe we just need more respect for Twilight. If you are interested in Trojan War myth retellings, do pick up a copy of Creepy Classics Ghost Stories from Ancient Greece. As I mentioned earlier, it has Achilles and Patroclus in here as lovers. It also has Odysseus in the underworld. If you'd like to support the channel, do consider picking up either one of my books. They're available paperback or ebook on Kobo, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Apple, Fable, wherever you buy books. And if you think I'm an absolute idiot whose opinions are worthless, then share the video with somebody so that they can get angry at me too. Or if not, give it a like. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bye! He is still in his surgical t-shirt. Yes, I'm talking about you, Loki. Because the wound isn't quite healed, but out of the crate. So much happier now that he's out of the crate and can sit with me in the study instead of being caged up all the time, poor dog.